All right, it is really, really dark and gloomy here today, so I've put on as many lights as I can to brighten this up. Hey friends, welcome or welcome back. My name is Shannon, and today we are going to talk about a very unfortunate time in Boston's history where Boston was one of the greatest offenders of censorship. I am located here in Boston, and it seemed like a great video for me to film in celebration of Banned Books Week, which is starting as of the date that this video goes up, September 22nd, and runs through September 28th. Banned Books Week is an event where people are encouraged to either read banned books or take action against the banning of books. And I will put all of the information in the description box regarding this event. Most of the information that I'm going to tell you about was obtained from this book, Banned in Boston, The Watch and Ward Society's Crusade Against Books, Burlesque, and the Social Evil by Neil Miller. I am a Massachusetts native. I was born in Boston, lived in Boston proper when I was a child and a couple times as an adult. And the term banned in Boston was always something that was thrown around my entire life, but I never truly understood really what it meant until I was an adult. And then I knew that Boston just had the worst reputation with respect to censorship during a particular period of time in our history. And for about 90 years, the Boston Watch and Ward Society dedicated themselves to ridding Boston of objectionable books, songs, movies, theater productions. And because Boston and Massachusetts laws at that time allowed for censorship, many works of art were legally banned for obscenity, and those who sold or distributed such obscenity were often jailed and or fined. And the consequence of that was Boston, which was once a great cultural center, was considered backward, less sophisticated, and the term banned in Boston became associated with works that were considered naughty and lurid. So let's do a little bit of a rewind and talk about how Boston was founded. And if you see me looking down, it's because I'm looking at my notes. There's so much information that I want to tell you, and I don't want to miss anything. Boston and Massachusetts were founded and controlled for many years by Puritans. And Puritans were English Protestants who wanted the Church of England to be more reformed than it already was, to get rid of the remnants of Roman Catholicism, which was left over after the Reformation. For those of you who know English history, the Reformation occurred when Henry VIII broke from Rome and wanted to be the head of his own church. He wasn't, he was still a Catholic, but he didn't want the Pope controlling him and controlling his country. So he broke from Rome, established the Church of England, and Protestantism, which was already in effect, basically took hold in England because of this. And the Puritans basically believed that the Protestants of the time were not Protestant enough. As we know from our childhood history lessons, the Pilgrims, who came to the New World and founded Plymouth Colony in the early 1600s, they were a separatist group that wanted local church congregations, not a state-established church. So they didn't want to be part of the Church of England. They just wanted little church groups. So they basically removed themselves from the Church of England because they considered it too corrupt. So they left England so that they could practice the religion that they wanted. Funny enough, they also expelled people for unorthodox beliefs. The Rhode Island colony, which is now the state of Rhode Island, was founded by settlers expelled from the Massachusetts Bay colony. And as you know, the Puritans also burned witches. I do find it funny that people who left their homes and country to come to a place to be able to do what they want and practice their religion freely were often expelling people for doing that very thing, for having different views. So I am not surprised that Puritans would also ban literature. There were many instances in the 16 and 1700s of the Puritans banning literature, but we're actually not going to talk about that period. One thing I will say about the Puritans is that they were a very literate society because they wanted everyone to be able to read the Bible. They taught everybody to read, including their children and the women. Now, you may have heard the term Boston Brahmin or WASP, which is White Anglo-Saxon Protestant, in relation to Boston. And these are the descendants of the Puritans. They were the people who, came from white Europe, mainly from England, and they were considered the founders of the Boston area. And so these Boston Brahmins were in charge until the 1820s, when the Irish Catholics started to arrive, and the Irish Catholics also brought with them their conservative views. The New England Society for the Suppression of Vice, that is who we're going to be talking about here in this video, and was the study of this book. They were founded in 1878 as a branch of the New York Society for the Suppression of Vice, which was founded by Anthony Comstock. A few years earlier, Anthony Comstock had been able to pass the federal Comstock Law, which gave the U.S. Postal Service the power to ban any items from the mail deemed obscene, lewd, lascivious, or of indecent character. This also included any materials related to birth control. If you remember from a couple videos back when I went over my banned books collection, I had mentioned that a lot of books were banned from the mail and I couldn't quite understand how that had happened. Well, this is how it had happened. This Anthony Comstock was able to have this law passed where the United States Postal Service forbid anything obscene from the mails. Comstock was also involved in a famous entrapment of a woman named Madame Restel, who was a well-known New York abortionist. I actually have a book about that incident, which I do plan on picking up very soon. The term Comstockery was coined by George Bernard Shaw after Comstock described Shaw as a, quote, Irish smut dealer due to Shaw's play Mrs. Warren's Profession, which was about a prostitute. So the term Comstockery became a term of ridicule and a synonym for Puritanism, censorship, and the general moral squeamishness of the time. Comstock's methods were loud, brash, violent, and he was kind of a showman. So H.L. Mencken, who was a publisher at the time, called him, quote, a sort of Barnum. A band always followed him, playing in the time to his yells. He could not undertake even so banal a business as raiding a dealer in abortifacient pills without giving it the melodramatic air of a battle with a brontosaurus, end quote. Boston didn't appreciate Comstock's loud methods. They preferred to do things in a more genteel, quiet manner. And in addition, they did not like Comstock's request that the Boston branch send money to the New York branch. So they broke with the New York Society, taking on all of the New England states as their territory. And then in 1891, they changed the name to the Boston Watch and Ward Society. So in the late 1870s, at the time the society was founded, post-Civil War Boston was in great upheaval. The city was expanding rapidly. Areas of Boston, the Back Bay and the South End, were essentially created out of nowhere. The suburbs were absorbed into the city, such as Roxbury, Dorchester, Brighton, Charlestown, and West Roxbury. I lived in Charlestown when I was a kid, so I'm very familiar with that area. The Massachusetts economy was in decline, and it was not helped by the Panic of 1873. So there was a depression after the Civil War in the 1873. And then you have large waves of immigration that were transforming the city. So first you've got the Irish coming in, then you have the Italians, Eastern European, Chinese, so lots of immigration happening in Boston at this time. And so the old money Brahmins, those descendants of the Puritans, felt like they were losing their grip. According to Boston historian Thomas O'Connor, quote, "In an age dominated more and more by material forces and secular philosophies, Puritan Christianity's old moral concepts seemed alarmingly out of place. Many of the old Boston families viewed the post-war period as completely alien in contrast to the pre-war society in which they had lived and flourished." So the Boston Brahmins were freaking out. They were losing their grip on society. And so this was the backdrop of how the Boston Watch and Ward Society came to be and how its members consisted of the Brahmin aristocracy. You've got the Coolidges, the Forbes, the Lawrences, the Lodges, the Peabodys, Welds, Lowells, and Cabots. There's actually a very famous saying here in Boston that the Lowells talk only to the Cabots and the Cabots talk only to God. The early focus of the Watch and Ward Society was censorship and gambling. Prostitution and drugs were added later, but they really wanted to crack down on censorship and gambling. They were involved heavily with investigating and even acting as its own police force to clean up gambling houses and prostitution houses, and even once brought down a corrupt district attorney. But we're actually not going to focus on their gambling cleanup or their prostitution cleanup or their corruption cleanup. I'm really only going to focus on the censorship. But if you do want to learn more about the gambling and prostitution cleanup that they did, definitely check out this book because it does dedicate several chapters to that. The Watch and Ward Society's very first official action was to suppress the sale of immoral and sensational papers and books that were generally sold at railroad station newsstands and on the trains. So what they did was they sent a petition to the railroad company asking them to remove the materials, and the railroad complied. No questions asked. They were just like, sure, whatever. And the reason this was easy is because Massachusetts law at that time banned materials that were, quote, contained language obscene, indecent, or impure. I mean, that could mean anything. Unfortunately for the society, what was harder to control was literature, because even if it didn't contain an indecent word or sentence, it was still able to, quote, excite the imagination and inflame the passions, thereby corrupting the morals and debasing the life, according to a society report. No law covered such reading material, so what the society did was they managed to have the law amended to add some language to the obscenity, indecent, or impure part of the law, and then added, quote, or manifestly tending to the corruption of the morals of youth. The first work of literature that the society went after was Leaves of Grass, which was getting a new edition in the 1880s. It had been around since the 1850s, but the society went after it and urged the district attorney to write to the publisher demanding removal of certain poems that they deemed too sexual. Walt Whitman, who is the author of Leaves of Grass, would not allow the removals, so the publisher refused to publish, and so Whitman found another publisher. And because of that, this controversy actually increased sales for Whitman. So he made out a little bit. And so it probably wasn't published in Boston, but other cities were able to publish it, and Walt Whitman did make out. In the early 1900s, the way that the society went after these books was to entrap booksellers for selling books that the society had deemed violated Massachusetts law, and then come back and have them arrested and brought to trial, where the courts would then determine whether the book was obscene under the law. So basically, no court had said that these works were obscene, They instead just went after the booksellers, who they said, well, you should know whether these books are obscene. You should know whether you can sell these books. So what they did was they just went after the booksellers, brought them to court, and then hash everything out in court and then ruled whether the books were to be obscene or not. And like I said, their rationale was that the booksellers should know what is obscene. I mean, the law was just too open to interpretation. Anything could be deemed obscene. And so the society wasn't loving all of the publicity that these court cases were causing. So what they did was they set up a gentleman's agreement with the booksellers. So the society would give the booksellers names of books that they found objectionable, and the booksellers could either remove the books or risk getting arrested. Booksellers themselves had their own association called the Boston Booksellers Association, where they also met to determine if certain books were objectionable before they even reached the shelves. And if they disagreed, then they'd submit it to the district attorney for the final decision. So basically, we're now engaging in self-censorship here to avoid being arrested by the society or by the local police. So in this time, most of the censorship in Boston was self-censorship, not legal censorship, because it never actually made it to the courts because of this gentleman's agreement. The booksellers were happy because they avoided getting arrested. The society was happy because the books were removed in a genteel Brahmin fashion without fuss or publicity. And the public never knew what was happening. Nobody knew different. The society at this time had so much power that even the district attorney wouldn't go against them and just put on trial whomever the society determined should be arrested. It wasn't until the late 1920s when publishers and authors started fighting back. In 1927, 1928, knowledge of the society's dealings were now made public because of various court cases, and the society actually found themselves as part of a lawsuit for the illegal restraint of trade. So the publishers were just not having it anymore. They started now going after the society for restricting their business. So at this time, the gentleman's agreement fell apart, and basically what happened, there was a free-for-all beginning in 1927. Booksellers weren't warned ahead of time, and they just had to take their chances that they wouldn't be arrested at the call of the Boston Police Commissioner, the district attorney, or the society. And the Catholic Church even got themselves involved into suppression. And at this time, we have another loosening of societal mores. So after the Civil War, we had a little bit of loosening. Now, in the 1920s, we've got the Jazz Age, where post-World War I, we have another loosening of morals. And so more works were being published reflecting these societal changes. You've got Upton Sinclair, Faulkner, Hemingway, Eugene O'Neill, Theodore Dreiser, D.H. Lawrence. All of these authors were publishing more frank books. But what was happening in Boston was, because there was no gentleman's agreement, nobody knew what was going to be deemed obscene. And nobody knew who was responsible for determining whether these books were obscene and arresting the booksellers. It was just complete chaos. So in 1928, a New York Times reporter, Mary Lee, reported that the situation in Boston was like a Kafka story. Quote, "No one is sure who the censor is. Nobody understands the reasons for his decisions. Nobody knows whether or not the violation of the taboo against certain books would actually mean prosecution, or if it did, whether it would be upheld in a court of law. Nevertheless, the mysterious censor is obeyed, and obeyed through what might almost be termed a panic of fear." End quote. The same reporter, Mary Lee, had obtained some unofficial list maintained by the booksellers, and she noted that of the 70 titles on the list, only 2 were actually held to be obscene by an actual court. And that was An American Tragedy by Theodore Dreiser, and Oil by Upton Sinclair. The other 68 books on the list were there because of someone's private opinions. And how these private opinions were determined or communicated, nobody really knew. And so it was in this free-for-all that the term banned in Boston was coined and became a mockery. And according to Elmer Davis of Harper's Monthly, quote, "The city which used to write the most of American literature was now forbidden by the police to read most of American literature." We're now into 1929, and the society made a huge blunder by entrapping a bookseller at a bookstore favored by Harvard University. And they entrapped this bookseller into selling Lady Chatterley's Lover. The bookseller was fined and jailed, and Harvard students were absolutely enraged because many of Harvard's professors were members of the Boston Watch and Word Society. So the students started protesting. They refused to attend classes or live in student housing where the headmaster was a member of the society. They gathered money to pay the court fees and fines of the bookseller that was arrested. And during the bookseller's trial appeal, the society's methods were disparaged by the courts and the press, and it was not good for their reputation. The bookseller's appeal was lost, and they were still fined, and Lady Chatterley was still deemed obscene, and the book legally banned. But because of this fiasco, this prompted the legislation to reform the obscenity law so that obscene language and passages were not enough to ban a book. It had to be viewed in the context of an entire work. After this fiasco, we're now into the 1930s, and the society made a little bit of a retreat due to all of the publicity. And so they stated that they wouldn't bring censorship cases on their own and said that they wouldn't give an opinion in advance as to the legality of certain books. But this was all a lie. And maybe it wasn't a lie, maybe they intended to do it, but that is not how it was shaking out. And they basically reverted back to the gentleman's agreement where they were quietly nudging booksellers to remove certain books for sale, thereby avoiding the publicity of the courts. And at this time in the 1930s, there was also some highly publicized involvement in the censorship of movies. They went after the movie version of A Farewell to Arms. They also went after theater. They went after The Children's Hour by Lillian Hellman and Waiting for Lefty by Clifford Odets. And they started to also go after burlesque performances. In the 1940s, the Watch and Word Society was weakening due to everything that had happened in the late 20s and the 30s. So the booksellers themselves, their associations, took it upon themselves in collaboration with the police commissioner in self-censorship. Basically, the booksellers and the police virtually controlled what people in Boston could read in the 1940s. And it was a slightly updated version of the gentleman's agreement. And according to a member of this association, he said, "We have set up a committee of the Board of Trade of Boston Book Merchants. Whenever the committee thinks that a book may be prosecuted by the police, it notifies the booksellers that the book has been withdrawn from sale by stores represented on the committee. That notification suffices. No Boston bookseller sells that book, knowing that if the police should prosecute him, the Board of Trade would not come to his defense. Everyone is happy. The affair has been conducted in complete privacy, free of official dictation and social control. There has been no official censorship. No one has achieved any objectionable publicity. The police are tranquil and the booksellers safe. And if any freedom of any Bostonian or any author has been infringed, Boston does not give a damn." And here comes Forever Amber by Kathleen Winsor. That was published in 1944, and it was selling like hotcakes. So the society decided to go behind the back of the booksellers and the police and write to the publishers of Forever Amber, who then panicked and withdrew the book from Boston. No trial, no hearing, it just disappeared. Booksellers were not pleased because they would have made a lot of money in sales of this book. And this huge loss of money incentivized booksellers to join the Massachusetts Library Association in lobbying to change the censorship laws even further. The new censorship law was enacted in 1945 and established that a bookseller could be prosecuted only if they sold a book that had been legally ruled obscene, and if the person to whom it was sold was under 18. In addition, only a district attorney or attorney general could bring suit to prevent the sale of the book. No legal action by police or private societies, such as the Watch and Ward, was allowed, although they still could persuade said district attorney to bring suit. Lastly, the merits of a book as literature or scholarship was permitted as evidence. Forever Amber was the first test case of this new law because it hadn't been ruled obscene, so booksellers were thrilled to start selling it. However, it was brought suit by a Hampden County district attorney, so in Springfield, Massachusetts, and the book was ruled illegal to sell. However, the Massachusetts Superior Court judge reversed the decision, stating that the book was not obscene, and in fact, he fell asleep reading it because it was so tedious. So thanks to the society going behind the backs of the booksellers and causing them to lose money, the law was changed, and now we have not a perfect law here, but better than what was before. In the 1950s and 60s, after everything that happened with Forever Amber and the new law being implemented, the society kind of fell out of censorship and instead focused on gambling, drugs, and prostitution. They even changed its name to the New England Citizens Crime Commission. And the new business model was to emphasize community cooperation, education, and prevention of crime and vice. So even though the society was now taking a step back from censorship, censorship in Massachusetts had not stopped. It just wasn't led by the Boston Watch and Ward Society. And we're now at the time where books that had been quietly banned by the society in the past were now in circulation because they had never been legally ruled obscene. And so now we have some new court cases legally ruling on obscenity. And one example of that was God's Little Acre by Erskine Caldwell. That had been banned by the society quietly in the past, but now in the 60s, it was legally ruled obscene. In addition, Boston had a city censor who focused on censoring theater productions such as Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf by Edward Albee and the musical Hair, which had come out in the 60s. However, the tide started to turn in the late 50s, specifically with the 1957 U.S. Supreme Court ruling that the portrayal of sex is not itself sufficient reason to deny First Amendment protection. So this ruling led to a whole bunch of overturnings of laws and rulings. For example, one major overturn was the Comstock Law, and that was overturned, and thus Lady Chatterley's Lover was allowed in the U.S. mail. And then various Massachusetts rulings against obscene books were overturned. Tropic of Cancer by Henry Miller, Naked Lunch by William Burroughs, and Fanny Hill by John Cleland. So by the time the late 60s rolled around, Bostonians could generally purchase whatever books that they wished. So we have that long period of the late 1870s to the late 1960s where censorship in Boston was rife, and anything and everything that could be censored was censored here in Boston. and we were made a joke. Nobody could bring their books here or their theater here or their movies here without worrying whether someone was going to stop the theater production in the middle of the production and arrest the actors, which did happen. Um, you didn't know if you were a bookseller whether you were going to get arrested for selling something that you didn't deem obscene, but some random guy in the society thought was obscene, and then brought to court, and then the court deemed it obscene. So it was just a long period of unfortunate history here in Boston. Now, that's not the end for the Boston Watch and Word Society. Even though they got out of the censorship game, they're still around. And in 1967, the New England Citizens Crime Commission, which was the Boston Watch and Ward Society's new name, became the Massachusetts Council on Crime and Correction. In 1975, it became the Crime and Justice Foundation. And in 1999, it was renamed the Community Resources for Justice and is still in effect today. And it is a social service and advocacy organization. So that is the sad history of censorship here in Massachusetts, specifically in Boston. And this book really was great. So if you're interested in learning more about it, I do highly recommend picking up Banned in Boston. And don't forget about Banned Books Week, which is happening now. Please read some banned books. Write some letters to your council people, your legislators, to ensure that people have access to books and they're not being removed from libraries or stores or anything like that. I'll have the information for the event in the description box. That is all I have for you today. Thank you so much for joining, and have a great day. Bye.